Today we're going to talk about school choice in American politics. Going to get a brief overview of a little bit of the history of school choice in American politics and talk about maybe a little bit of some of the current trends that are going on today in school choice. And we're going to, we've already talked about in our readings, we've read about Ronald Reagan in the 1980s and his attempts to in some ways dismantle the newly reformed Department of Education federally. And one of the other things that Ronald Reagan had advocated for that was kind of in line with his conservative desire to, in some ways, scale back government was to create alternatives to a public school system that he saw as being too big, too centralized, too costly. And one of the ways to do that was he decided to try to pursue avenues of school choice. So we're going to talk about vouchers largely. And vouchers, so that you know, are instead of having students go to the public schools that they're zoned for or pay for private schooling above and beyond the tax dollars for public schooling, vouchers in a sense would have government redistribute tax funds to parents and families in the form of educational vouchers that they could then use to go to private schools. So instead of the assumption being that you're going to go to public school unless you want to pay for private school yourself, the idea is, well, government can actually give you the funding to pay for whatever school you'd like. So if you want to go to private school, you can do that with government funds. If you want to go to an existing public school, your public funds will go to that public school. So there were a few vouchers were already in the air a little bit in terms of as an idea before Reagan took office in 1980. So the first thing is that two economists and public figures, notably Milton Friedman and Christopher Jencks, had already written about voucher proposals. You saw Milton Friedman in the video, the Free to Choose video that we're looking at in class, but in 1955 he wrote an article called The Role of Government in Education. And it was pretty significant because Friedman was a pretty well-known economist. He would later go on to win the Nobel Prize. And he had always kind of championed market solutions to public problems. And what he thought was that the market can be used to actually improve educational quality. People could actually use, public vouchers to shop around for schools just the same way they shop around for cars or any other kind of service. And he thought that this would be a good idea in terms of everyone should have access to vouchers so that they don't just go to the public school, they can go to whatever school they'd like. Another advocate of vouchers, though, came from the left, came from the political left of center. And it was a guy named Christopher Jencks, who was a professor and a public figure in, he worked with the Office of Educational Opportunity in the 1970s. And he suggested that, particularly for the poor, vouchers would be a good idea, particularly because inner city schools had shown increasingly bad performance over the years. And he figured, well, it's not fair that the rich and others may be able to go to private schools because they can afford tuition while the poor are stuck with the public schools because they can't. So what we might do is create these targeted voucher programs for poor people in inner cities that would give them a certain amount of money that they could use to shop around for education. So if they want to go to a local private school, they can. Another voucher proposal that took place in 1959 and 1963 was in Prince Edward County, Virginia. And unfortunately, it had a fairly bad motive. It was to get around Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Brown versus Board said that all public schools had to, that no public school could segregate on the basis of race, that if you had African American students living in your area, you had to accept them to schools just as you had to accept white students. And some districts didn't like this, particularly in the South, and Prince Edward County decided that a good way to get around it would be to actually shut down their public schools, give all of their students vouchers that they could use to private schools. And understandably, in a segregated area like that, it actually was a license to allow people to segregate. So students really frequented segregated private schools rather than creating, going to integrated public schools. In 1972 to 1975, Alum Rock School District in San Jose, California, created a voucher program that was, instead of, it wasn't a system of private schools that you could choose from, but what they did was they took their public schools and they created little mini private schools or little mini schools within the public schools. So you could choose which of these little mini schools you went to. And in some ways, they competed for dollars the same way that a private school would compete for dollars in a voucher program. That lasted a few years. It was tough going, largely because there was a lot of political opposition to it from teachers' unions, administration, and some of the general public also. And then in 1976, there was a failed attempt to create a voucher program in the state of New Hampshire in several districts. And they didn't get enough votes for it, largely because there was some controversy over whether they should allow students to use their funds to religious private schools. And they decided that that might be a constitutional issue, so the programs that they were looking at did not allow private funds to religious schools. And that caused a lot of people who might have otherwise supported the voucher program not to actually support the voucher program. So that was a failed attempt. But as you can see, before Ronald Reagan took office, there were several attempts to create voucher programs, successful and non-successful. And like I said, Ronald Reagan, being somewhat conservative politically, wanted to really kind of take power away from a public school system that he thought was becoming too large, wasn't accountable to the American people in the same way that it would be in a market where you could take your dollars elsewhere if you weren't pleased with the service. So this is a statement from his 1984 State of the Union, where he talks about kind of competition being needed among schools, just like in other areas where competition might increase the quality of things over time because different companies are competing for your dollars. The idea was if you increase competition in schooling, you'll get schools that are run more efficiently, cost effectively, and schools that, because they're competing for dollars, are also trying to outdo one another in terms of service. Ronald Reagan, as you read in the book, while education was a somewhat important issue to him, he never really saw it as a huge issue and never saw it as an issue that would win much in terms of political clout. He pushed a few voucher programs or voucher proposals into Congress, and they were never successful. So the Reagan administration kind of backed off of the education issue. They pushed it a little bit and occasionally, but they didn't push it as much as they could have. So in post-Ronald Reagan era, we have two predominant voucher programs, and these are two of many programs. These are just the two probably most visible programs in the post-Reagan era. So in 1990, the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin decided to create a targeted voucher program, so more along the lines of what Christopher Jencks was thinking, that was geared towards poor people in the inner cities. You had to make below a certain amount of money, and the deal was you would get a certain amount of money that you could use to send your children to private schools, whether it was a religious private school, a secular private school, etc. And while the consumer satisfaction seemed to be pretty high with that program in the few years after it started, there was some controversy about whether allowing public dollars to be spent towards private religious schooling violated their state constitution or the federal constitution, which kind of mandates in some ways a separation between church and state, that public money is not really to be used for religious purposes. So it went to this case went to the state Supreme Court, and in I believe it was 1994, the state Supreme Court found that the program was actually okay because the money went to the parents, not directly to the schools. So think of it like a church bake sale, which is the analogy that Milton Friedman used. He said if you get state, let's say welfare money, and you decide to use that money towards a church bake sale, technically you're using public money to a religious purpose, but you're the one who's choosing where that money goes, not the state. So that's the same rationale the state Supreme Court used. The state is giving money to parents. Parents have the option to go to religious schools or non-religious schools. If they choose religious schools, that's really the parents' choice, not the state's choice. So there's no violation of a separation of church and state. And in 1996, the city of Cleveland, Ohio, decided to do a voucher system that was similar. It was geared towards poor parents, and it allowed them to choose either religious schools or secular schools. And this case actually went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Zelman v. Simmons-Harris in 2002. And the court had a similar reasoning. Well, it's really not the state money going to religious schooling itself. It's the state money going to parents, and parents have the option of going to a religious school or a non-religious school. So the law has a secular purpose. The law does not discriminate by religious or non-religious schooling. Non-religious schools are as eligible to receive funds as religious schools. So they suggested that the church-state issue is really not an issue at all. So church-state matters in terms of whether vouchers are constitutional if they allow religious schools has pretty well been settled, and we haven't seen that issue come up again since Selman's v. Simmons-Harris. And in terms of the contemporary climate, the last I saw, the National Council of State Legislatures suggested that 13 states plus the District of Columbia provide state-funded school vouchers to qualifying students, usually again to poor parents in inner-city schools. I don't believe that the District of Columbia actually has a voucher system anymore. I think last year it was dismantled, but as far as I know, the 13 states quote is accurate. But there's also another movement that has superseded the voucher movement in terms of popularity, and it's called a charter movement. And it's sort of a school choice movement, but it's not quite as extreme as the voucher movement. So here's a diagram I have on the left of what voucher movement really does. The government gives money, tuition money to parents, and then parents choose to go to a private school with that money. That's what a voucher system does. Well, on the right side, you can see what a charter system is. What happens is you have a school that's a privately run school, and it agrees to certain terms in order to become part of a public system, even though it is privately run. And what happens is students can, in a district where there's a charter school, students can actually apply to the charter school just like they would to a private school. And the money actually doesn't go to the parents and then goes to the school. It goes directly to the school. So if there is, let's say, 200 students that go to a particular charter school, the government gives the school the equivalent of 200 students operating costs in the public system. And the school, again, as part of the public system, it has to do certain things in order to be part of the public system, usually agree to certain state curricular standards, things like that. But it is part of the public system. So charters probably aren't as controversial as vouchers are in the sense that they are part of the public system, but they are pretty controversial. And in fact, charters have seen a lot more success than vouchers. So according to the Friedman Foundation, which is an organization that studies school choice, 42 states plus Washington, D.C. have charter school laws, and there are 2.3 million students attending roughly 6,000 charter schools in the U.S. So that's a pretty big deal. And if you look at a lot of the school choice proponents and school choice opponents today, they gear themselves more towards speaking of charter schools rather than voucher programs, because I think the sense is that charter schools have the larger likelihood of success because it's not as radical a step as the voucher movement. So we have roughly some arguments for and against charters and vouchers today. So the arguments for include simply the idea of individual choice, just like we choose cars, homes, etc. In a market kind of system. The idea is, well, schooling should also be provided for in a market so that people can choose what schools they go to rather than have to be zoned for them. The counter-argument to this, of course, though, is that schooling is maybe a public good and a public service. If we remember talking about the externalities that schooling creates, it doesn't just create value for me, the consumer, it creates value for all the other people around me who benefit by the fact that I'm educated. So there's a fear that vouchers and charters are essentially going to take what's a public good and a public service and make it a private commodity. Another argument for public school or for charters and vouchers is that competition will make schools better. Just as when we buy cars and houses, we accept the idea that Ford, Chevy, Hyundai, Toyota, they're all competing for my dollars, and because they're competing for my dollars, they're going to offer a better quality car at a lower price than they would if they were a monopoly. So the same kind of idea can be applied to public schools. Monopolies are bad because they end up really having a monopoly on your choice. You can't choose out of them, which means they offer you the service that they want to offer you, and you don't have the opportunity to go elsewhere. Of course, the counter-argument to this is that vouchers and charters may threaten to make public schools worse. So if the problem is that public schools are not performing well, the worst thing we might do is to actually take money out of the public school system by offering people a way out of the public school system. So while maybe having exit rights is good in terms of, let's say, a car company. If I'm not pleased with Chevy, I can go with Ford or Toyota. Maybe in a public school system it might be bad, because if the goal is to improve public schooling, the worst thing that can happen is you take money out of the public school system. Lastly, some people argue that markets and choice in schools is better for diversity and pluralism. If I want to go to a school that's more of a free-form school, like a progressive kind of school, and you want to go to a more authoritarian, structured, disciplined school, we can do that. If I want to go to a Catholic school and you want to go to a secular school, we can do that under a choice market, because just like Ford and Chevy may offer different kinds of cars, different schools will offer different services, and different people can best find the kind of school that suits them. On the other hand, the argument against this would be that this might also risk making inequality worse, because if we can go to different kinds of schools, that also means that the rich can go to schools that have only rich people, and the poor will go to schools that are poor in quality and contain mostly poor people. And just like we saw in Prince Edward County, maybe white people will go to schools with other white people, and African Americans will go to schools with other African Americans, and different religions will go to different schools. So it'll become more factionized, and the ideal of the public school, where everyone kind of goes to school together, will kind of be threatened by this movement. So I'm not going to take a stand here. I just want to kind of give you the facts, the history, and the arguments that are being used. But if you go online and do some researching, you'll see that school choice is a really, really controversial issue today, largely because of the success of charter movements and the more limited success of voucher movements. So this is something that really kind of came about during the Reagan administration, that has definitely increased a lot more after the Reagan administration.